Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. I'd like to talk in this next series of videos about the endocrine system. This is another control system that it exerts influence over the body that allows you to do exquisite things. But unlike the nervous system, which is hardwired, this involves the release of chemicals into the bloodstream to be able to exert effects. I'm going to do this in a systematic way to be able to go through and talk about some of the controls and the feedback mechanisms. So let's get started. So first off, as I mentioned, I have the ability to release these hormones, these molecules, to travel in the blood to some sort of target organs and to exert their effect. Now, those hormones could be proteins or peptides. Some of them are steroid-based. They're made from cholesterol. Things like cortisone and your sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are steroid-based. Aldosterone is another steroid-based. And we'll talk about that steroidogenesis in a bit as we talk about the systems. Some of them are derivatives of amino acid tyrosine, in particular epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are produced in the medulla of the adrenal gland, as well as a thyroid hormone. And these hormones will travel through the bloodstream and bind with a cell membrane receptor, or they may go into the cell itself and bind with the receptor there and exert the effects. Now, many, but not all, hormones have a feedback control mechanism. That means that they can either, if they become too high or too low, negatively or positively feedback to correct that. I'll give you an example of this with sex hormones. For example, estradiol and testosterone are the hormones that will exert influence to cause changes, secondary sexual characteristics, for example, through puberty. And they are actually stimulated to be released by an anterior pituitary set of hormones called luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So this LH or FSH is released from the anterior pituitary. But if I have too much estradiol or testosterone, it will negatively feed back on the anterior pituitary to cause less LH and FSH to be released. There is also another hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone, that comes from the hypothalamus that stimulates the anterior pituitary cells that produce LH and FSH to produce those. And so there is also a negative feedback to control that if there would be too much testosterone or estradiol. Similarly, if there's too little, then that actually will feed back to produce more of those precursor hormones. There is one hormone, oxytocin, that is operated under positive feedback, where the release of that hormone feeds back to release more of the hormone. And that's because oxytocin is involved with childbirth, and childbirth is not something you want to drag out over a long period of time. We'll talk about these mechanisms as we go through and talk about the hormones. So in general, you have a problem with the endocrine system if there is too much or too little of the hormone. If there's an excess of the hormone, you can evaluate that with testing to not only measure the hormone and its precursors, if applicable, but you can also do a suppression test to see if it responds. Or if there's too little or a deficiency of the hormone, you can not only measure the amount or its precursors, but you can evaluate it with a stimulation test. Let's get started from the brain. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands are two glands that are found just behind where your optic nerve is. And if you remember when we talked about the basal ganglia, behind that was the thalamus. So all of that area in the midbrain, in the anterior frontal portion of that, you will have a very small but important gland called the hypothalamus. And then just below that, you have the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland actually embryologically comes from two different types of tissue. One of them, which forms the posterior pituitary, comes from tissue that is of nervous system derivation, and the other comes from the roof of the mouth, which is going to form the anterior pituitary. Now, some people frame the hypothalamus as a master gland because it releases numerous hormones that will travel through a special set of blood vessels between it and the pituitary gland and then cause the release of various other hormones. There is discussion, or we talk about sort of a hypothalamic pituitary axis, that is that the hypothalamic hormone then causes some effect on the cells in the pituitary gland to release their hormones. So for example, we have thyrotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, which then will cause the cells in the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, also prolactin. There's others gonadotropin releasing hormone, which I mentioned earlier, that will go through, and we'll talk about those. One of the things that I did want to show you also is if you look at the structure of this, the hypothalamus lies, as I mentioned, just anterior to the thalamus and has a very small stalk that then goes down to the pituitary gland. And that infundibulum, that little stalk-like piece that goes through it, will actually then allow for the secretion into the special bloodstream that will flow between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So let's talk a little bit about the hypothalamic hormones. As we go through and talk about these hormones, I'll talk about them briefly, because when we talk about the further down hormones in this axis, we'll talk about them at that point more. So there are several hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. Thyrotropin releasing hormone will stimulate the release of TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and prolactin, which we'll talk in detail about in a few minutes. Corticotropin releasing hormone will stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. Actually, it's a combination of ACTH and another hormone that will act to darken skin, but we'll talk about that when we talk about cortisol. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, which I mentioned before, stimulates the release of both FSH and LH. Growth hormone has a dual control. There is an inhibitory hormone and a releasing hormone. And both of these will either stimulate or inhibit the release of growth hormone, which will then act on the liver and then have its effect, which we'll talk about. And then dopamine, which sometimes in older literature is called prolactin inhibiting factor, is another hormone and also a neurotransmitter that is released from the hypothalamus that will inhibit the release of prolactin. Now, as I mentioned, the anterior and pituitary glands come from different embryologic origins. The anterior pituitary gland comes from tissue that is derived from the roof of the mouth, and the posterior pituitary from the neuroectoderm. The anterior pituitaries have several cell types, and they release hormones. Some of them will directly act, and others will act on other areas in the body. So thyrotropes are a type of cell that release thyroid stimulating hormone in response to thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And this TSH will then stimulate the production of thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland, and we'll talk about that in a later video. Corticotropes release technically POMC, which we'll talk about when we talk about cortisol, but we'll say here that it's the ACTH, which is a mouthful of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Everybody refers to it as ACTH. And this is going to be essential in the production of glucocorticoids and androgens in the adrenal gland, which we'll talk in detail about when we talk about the adrenal gland. Gonadotropes are cell types that will release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, or LH, luteinizing hormone, and they will be critical in the sexual characteristics for both males and females, and we'll talk about them in a bit when we talk about reproduction. Somatotropes are the types of cells in the anterior pituitary that release growth hormone, which will then stimulate cellular growth. through an IGF-1, which comes out of the liver. And lactotropes release prolactin, and they stimulate milk secretion and production. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. The posterior pituitary gland only has two hormones that are released. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that we spoke about when we were talking about the cortical collecting duct, and oxytocin, which is necessary for uterine contraction and also milk ejection. So let's talk about some of these anterior pituitary hormones that don't involve other glands. So I mentioned to you about growth hormone. So growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary somatotropes, and this is done in an episodic pulsatile fashion, normally during your sleep. If you are diurnal, you're up during the daytime, and you go to sleep at, let's say, 10 o'clock or so at night, you will start to peak release your growth hormone somewhere around 2 a.m. And if you are a night owl, if you actually are up and nocturnal, then this will actually be flipped to a daytime schedule where you'll actually have this pulsatile release. And the growth hormone, remember, is under the control of the hypothalamus, where I have both a releasing and an inhibiting hormone to help produce the pulsatile response of those somatotropes. Now, this is a peptide hormone. It binds to cell surface receptors, and it acts on the liver to produce this IGF-1, this insulin growth factor 1. And that is actually what exerts its effect on cells. And so what does it do? It helps you grow. Some people would say it also helps you repair as you've already grown. And so it promotes your proteins being formed and utilizing your fat. It decreases your carbohydrate use. It stimulates cartilage and bone growth. Now, when you're in your prepubescent years, this is appropriate for growing. When you're older and your bones have already fused together, this produces some problems that we'll talk about. So as I mentioned, hormonal diseases come in two flavors, sort of too much and too little. In the case of growth hormone, an excess can lead to two clinical syndromes. The first happens if you have too much growth hormone before you actually grow up, in other words, prepubescent. And that leads to gigantism, which you can see on the left in this picture of a person who had gigantism compared to a normal male of average height to the person's right. If that excess growth hormone occurs after the person has actually fused their growth plates, that can be from either the person having a tumor and secreting extra growth hormone, or from injection of growth hormone. Sometimes people have injected growth hormone into themselves to try to get bigger, and that can lead to acromegaly. And you see a picture on the right of Andre the Giant, who had reportedly acromegaly. And you can see some of the features, sort of this coarse brows above his eyebrows, where you had extra bone that was placed on there. If you have too little growth hormone during the prepubescent years, then you can have dwarfism. But if you look at all of the causes of short stature, this is an exceptionally rare cause of that. Another hormone that's released is prolactin. And remember, this is released by lactotropes in the anterior pituitary gland. This is a peptide hormone. It again binds to surface receptors, and it stimulates the production of milk secretion and the production and the development of mammary glands in the breasts. Now, this is unusual in that prolactin is dependent upon dopamine. Dopamine inhibits the release of prolactin. And remember that this dopamine is coming from the hypothalamus. So if there is not dopamine, or if it is in some way blocked, then you will have prolactin released by the lactotropes, and that will cause milk. So you can have sort of a couple different flavors of disease. If you have too much prolactin, then you get what's called galactoria. You produce milk. This is obviously an issue for females that have the capability of producing milk as opposed to males. And this can be from two different things. It could be from an adenoma, which is a growth in the pituitary cells that leads to dopamine not being released and therefore galactoria. And you can have that adenoma either be something that you can then surgically resect, or you can actually treat medically. The other thing that can happen that can cause galactoria is that some antipsychotic drugs block dopamine, and therefore they'll bind to that receptor so that it will block the receptor binding to dopamine on the lactotropes, and therefore you can have galactoria. You also have very, very rare condition where you can have a deficiency of prolactin that leads in the inability to lactate, but that's a very rare disease. In the posterior pituitary, there are two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, sometimes called vasopressin. And as I mentioned, this is the posterior pituitary along with oxytocin. And it's a hormone protein that binds to cell surface receptors. And it has two functions. We've talked about one of them. The one that we talked about is that if I have antidiuretic hormone present from the posterior pituitary, then I can have insertion of aquaporin 2 channels into the cortical collecting duct of the nephrons, that as long as I have an osmolar gradient in the interstitium, I can reabsorb water. And this will allow me to retain water when I increase serum osmolality. I have receptors in the hypothalamus for the osmolarity, and if it gets too high, somewhere above like 290 milliosmoles per liter, then I'll release ADH. The other that we did not talk about is if you lose a large volume of blood, generally at least 15 to 25%. And then there are receptors in both the atria and also baroreceptors in the carotid and large great vessels that say, oh, I need to make sure that I've got enough blood volume, so I want to retain as much water as possible, and I will also vasoconstrict the arterial side so that I can maintain blood pressure. Now, I can have antidiuretic hormone diseases. I can have too much and too little. If I have too much ADH, normally this is from an inappropriate secretion from a cancer. We call this a paraneoplastic syndrome. And certain types of, one type of lung cancer will actually do this and lead to what's called the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, or SIADH. And basically then, if you have that, you retain too much water, and you retain too much water, your sodium goes down. And this can sometimes be the way that you would figure out a person might have a lung cancer, although there are many causes of a low sodium in your blood. And then a deficiency can lead to a condition called diabetes insipidus, where you can't reabsorb water and you have lots and lots of urine that is dilute. We differentiate that into two causes: central, which is the pituitary gland not releasing ADH, and the second is nephrogenic, which is where the pituitary, posterior pituitary, does release ADH. However, the cortical collecting ducts don't respond to it. The last of the posterior pituitary hormones is oxytocin, and this is likewise a peptide hormone, binds to cell surface receptors, and it is used primarily for expelling the fetus from the gravid uterus when mom is ready to deliver the infant. And it is under positive feedback regulation. It is the only hormone that is under positive feedback regulation that we will talk about. And that's initiated by cervical stretch and pressures and contractions. And as the cervix dilates to allow the head and the body of the infant to come through the birth canal or the vagina, that will cause more and more oxytocin to be released. In fact, we have a synthetic mimic of this, which is called pitocin, that you can use to induce labor. It also is involved in milk expression, not milk production, but expression or release of that. And then there is some evidence that suggests that it also is involved in pair bonding. So this is the beginning part of the endocrine section, where we talked about the hypothalamic and some of the pituitary hormones. We'll come back and we'll talk about many other hormones across this. As always, if you enjoy these and find these lectures useful, you're welcome to subscribe or like this or leave me comments. Otherwise, I will see you soon.